If you go back to the mid-2000s, which was the coolest football team in the world? Was it Mourinho's Chelsea, maybe Ferguson's United or Madrid's Galacticos, or possibly Ancelotti's Milan? For me and millions of others, there was only one answer. It was the Brazilian national team.
You can sing like the canary, you can be a virtuoso. But believe me, you can make only beautiful music if you know how to play in an orchestra.
Brazil had it all. It had the Nike Joga Bonito commercials like the one you just heard. It had the likes of Roberto Carlos, Ronaldo, and Ronaldinho. It had the stepovers, and of course, the classic yellow shirts. It was mesmerizing, and millions around the world agreed. Within a decade, the Brazilian national team would be touring the world, entertaining fans from Switzerland to Singapore. But all good things in life come at a cost. Today we ask, are Brazilian fans falling out of love with their national team?
The relationship between Brazilian fans and the national team is, I would say, distant and probably deteriorating.
Joshua Law is a freelance writer and was previously an editor of Yellow and Green Football.
It's a relationship that's fractured over quite a long time, owing to a lot of factors. But people feel detached from the national team in a way that they never have before.
You know, before we get to the reasons why, have you ever been to a Brazilian national team game? And, you know, if you have, what was it like?
Yes, I have, both in the crowd as a fan and in the press box, which are two different experiences. I think the fans' experience is probably the most interesting one, going on the terraces. The first thing to say, the absolute most important thing, is it was really, really expensive. And I think that starts to get to the bottom of why the relationship is breaking down. So I think I paid, this was 3 or 4 years ago, I paid 350 reais to stand on a concrete terrace in the Arena Corinthians. So for a club game, a Corinthians game, to stand there, you would pay about 30 reais. So it's about 10 times more expensive than a club game. And with that comes a demographic shift. The Brazilian minimum wage, the monthly minimum wage, is around 1,000 reais, which is like under $200 per month. And the ticket is 400 or thereabouts. The cheapest ticket in the stadium is 400. So you get an idea. It's completely inaccessible to a substantial portion of the population. So the people around you as a fan are generally upper class or upper middle class, wealthy. They see going to Brazil games as much as a status symbol as it is an act of passion or real fanship. That already generates some apathy. That already generates a bit of distance between the team, both for normal people who can't afford to go and for these people who do go. Some of them will be genuinely interested in football, but not all of them. For some of them, it's just a sort of evening out. It's an alternative to going to the theatre or the opera, perhaps. And a lot of them you would never be seen dead at a Brazilian club football match. And then in terms of atmosphere, that has an effect. Obviously, it's not loud, there's not singing. There's a small group of people who are like a sort of ultras group for the Brazilian national team who do make a bit of noise. But apart from that, the stadium's pretty much silent, unless Brazil are playing badly, at which point they start to boo. It's weird because the team is so good often. When I saw them, they played amazingly. And then there's this just sort of apathetic response from the people in the stands, which is a real shame.
Has it always been like that? I mean, if we go back, a couple decades, was that the case? And if not, when did that shift kind of happen?
I mean, I can't speak from first-hand experience. I wasn't there, I don't know. But no is the one-word answer. I mean, the tickets became expensive probably in the last 15 years. Before that, I think it was reasonably accessible. Brazil played in Brazil much more. Like, just purely in economic terms, it was a less scarce opportunity, so that the price went down.
This is all, interesting because, to an outsider, this would come as a big surprise. Obviously, we, know the history of football in Brazil and, how much they love the sport. But, also a surprise considering they won the Copa America last year, something that they hadn't done since 2007.
Here's Charlison, drills it in, strips off the shirt because he knows Brazil are going to take this Copa America.
And they did it at home in Brazil. Can you kind of explain that gap, if you will? They won a major tournament on their home soil, and yet, based on kind of what you're saying, is that hasn't really changed the atmosphere.
I don't think it's changed the atmosphere. The Copa America in itself, I went to every Brazil game but one at the Copa America last year. And that in itself was a sort of an interesting experience from the point of the relationship between the fans and the team. So everything that I described about the fans before applied, perhaps even more so because some of the tickets were even more expensive. You'd like to think that they'd really get behind their team in the Copa America. But there was a sort of hangover from the World Cup the year before, which a lot of people perceived as a failure. They went out in the quarterfinals to Belgium.
And a great save from Courtois to deny Neymar. They are knocked out. The favourites have gone. Belgium have pulled off one of the biggest, if not the biggest win in their history.
Brazil's portrayed as this country where people play football for joy and it's just a sort of carnival in boots. It's just a complete misrepresentation. Brazilians love winning. They absolutely love winning. And the failure to win at the 2018 World Cup, when they had been built up quite a lot, they were favourites going into the tournament. That had a bit of a hangover. People were irritated with Chichi, the manager. The team was in transition a bit. Some of the players were changing. People didn't like some of the players that Chichi was bringing in. They accused him of favouritism. So there are these specific reasons related to the team. And then there's also the demographic reasons in the stadium. And the opening game against Bolivia, Brazil at half-time were drawing 0-0 and they got booed off the pitch at half-time in the opening game in the Morumbi in São Paulo. They weren't playing particularly well, but it beggars belief, really, that you'd go to a football match, a Brazil game in the Copa America, and then because haven't run into a 3-0 lead before half-time, people boo. It was a very, very strange atmosphere that night. And then the whole press, the reaction was based around the negative reaction from the crowd, and a lot of the players in the interviews, the post-match interviews, ended up talking about that. Particularly around the Copa America, there was a lot of sort of soul-searching because the games weren't all sold out, which again is a problem with the pricing of the tickets. So the Copa America last year was really the low point, I think.
Let's delve a little deeper into, some of the reasons why there is this growing disconnect between the fans and the team. You've mentioned already the higher ticket prices, but, can you go into a little bit more depth of why there's this growing disconnect? What are some of the other major reasons?
Right, so the other one that's cited quite often is the distance between the players. So most of the players who play for Brazil play in major European leagues. So Brazilian fans don't get to see them up close in person on a week-to-week basis. That's quite often cited as a contributing factor. Although I think it's probably overstated. In my opinion, that's slightly overstated because the big players, the big name players who are in the squad are still really popular and people can watch them on television. For me, a lot of the reason comes from the deal that Brazil have to play all of their friendly matches abroad. Brazil haven't played a friendly match in Brazil for over a decade. That hasn't been in the run-up to a major tournament. They played a couple of friendly matches in Brazil prior to the Copa America. So the CBF, the Brazilian FA, did a deal with a sports marketing company called Pitch. And that deal allows Pitch to sell the rights to host Brazil games anywhere they want in the world. So we've seen Brazil games in Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Miami, LA, all London, all over the world, but rarely in Brazil. And for me, that's one of the decisive factors. People don't get to have that close contact with the players. The players aren't coming back to the country. The players aren't close to people. They're not going round to cities in Brazil to play in games. And I think that's had a really, really big negative impact. That physical distance between the people and the team has put a sort of emotional, psychological distance between the people and the team as well.
I want to go back to the Brazilians playing in Europe, reason that you mentioned. How much do Brazilian fans follow players in Europe? I mean, how much do they follow Firmino in Liverpool and some of the other top Brazilian players, maybe even besides Neymar in Europe?
Right, I think Firmino is a good one to focus on, actually, because he's a perfect illustration of the issue. Firmino came through at Figueirense in the south of Brazil, and then he played one season in the Brazilian second division, which most people don't watch. His season, in which he did well, went unnoticed, and at the end of that season, Hoffenheim scouted him and took him to Germany. That took him completely out of the spotlight. So Brazilian fans, the average Brazilian fan, the one who's not really, really into football, who just has a sort of general interest or passing interest, had no idea who Roberto Firmino was, up until the point where he was called into the Brazil squad. And then that also creates a rift where the fan, the sort of casual fan, has their local favourite. There's the player who's playing really well for Palmeiras or Flamengo or Bahia or Grêmio or whoever it might be. And those fans, to some degree, want those players in the Brazil squad, and then they see this guy who plays for Hoffenheim, who they've never heard of, getting called into the Brazil squad. They've never seen him play. They have no idea how good he is, and that creates a sort of a negative atmosphere around the Seleção, and leads us also onto this question of calling up home-based players. There are a lot of people who would like Chichi or whoever the Brazil manager is to call up more home-based players. The quality of the Brazilian league has deteriorated quite badly over the last 3 decades or 2.5 decades. So there are some good players still, but it's difficult to make a case for calling up a majority home-based squad now that the best players are clearly mostly in Europe. So that creates a bit of discontent, and add to that, there's a problem, there's an issue. The Brazilian domestic football calendar has this insane schedule. So as well, in addition to the National League, like all other countries have, 38-game season, there are state championships. Necessarily reduces the amount of time available for playing the National League. On top of that, you have the Brazilian Cup and international competition, continental competitions. So this creates a situation where there are so many games in the Brazilian calendar that football cannot stop during international breaks. So even when players are called up from the local league, even if they're playing really well, it irritates the fans of the club that they play for. Sometimes it gets to the point of club fans accusing Chichi of trying to harm their prospects of winning the league or winning the cup or whatever it might be. So now it's even got to this point where people don't know the players who are being called up, but don't want their own players to be called up. So it's just this whole organisational mess that has led to this problem. And it all goes back to the CBF. The CBF has the power, if it wants, to stop teams playing state championships or to really reduce the state championships. The CBF sold the rights to pitch, to play all these friendlies all over the world. So really, the issue comes from the top. It's a top-down issue rather than a bottom-up issue.
You mentioned Pitch International before, the company that has organized the Brazil Global Tour. What do we know about that company? Obviously their primary interest is money and not really, how it affects the national team. But, what do we know about that organization?
It's a sort of small circle of people who do talk about them in Brazil. Small part of the press. People see the issue rather than the cause of the issue, I would say. The most interesting criticism that I remember came directly from Chichi, and I thought that was quite revealing. When they played in the USA last year. He criticised pitch for the state of the pitch, the grass, in the stadium in LA, I believe it was, in which they played, which was the first time I'd ever heard him or any Brazil manager criticise the company. That for me is the fundamental issue. Playing the friendlies all around the world is such a easy way to lose friends, and it's using the reputation that Brazil has built as a footballing superpower over the last 50, 60 years to make money in the short term, in the long-term detriment of the product that they are selling. And a lot of the teams that they play in those friendlies are weaker teams. The top European teams don't want to travel to Singapore or Saudi Arabia to play Brazil in a friendly. They'd much rather stay at home or travel to another Western European country. So it also has an impact on the quality of the opposition the Brazil team is facing, gives them fewer opportunities to play against the top teams, to test themselves, to get those difficult games in before they get to major tournaments.
Yeah, and of course, we didn't even mention that, by putting games in Singapore and in Europe and other places like that, obviously there's a huge time difference for people watching it back home. And, I found an interesting fact that Brazil has actually played more matches in the United States since this global tour started than they've actually played in Brazil. And that even counts their, warm-up friendly games. Do you see any circumstances in the near future or future where this relationship kind of returns to what it once was?
Honestly, it's difficult. It will be a long process if it happens. The CBF need to take full responsibility for making that happen. I think the players and the manager do as much as they can to make that happen. The players will keep going to Europe, they will keep going abroad because that's where the money is, that's where the best quality football is. They want to play for the best clubs. I don't think there's any onus on the players to take a patriotic stance and stay at home and never go abroad to play. I think the onus is on the authorities. Could they rebuild a sort of set of circumstances in which the Seleção would gain popularity again? They could. Absolutely they could. Could bring ticket prices down. They could play all Brazil friendlies in Brazil. They could have a better relationship through the media with people. But whether they will or not is a different question. The current CBF president, Rogério Caboclo, has shown some signs of being more progressive, but he was handpicked by the previous president to be his successor. So you have to be a little bit wary in those sort of circumstances. I don't hold out a lot of hope. I would love to see Brazil reconnect with its team. And if they win the next World Cup, that will help a lot. I don't have a great expectation that will happen.
Are you a fan of football today? Then why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full interviews, and extra content. Just go on Patreon and search Football Today. Now, back to the episode.
As Law just mentioned moments ago, much of Brazil's international fixtures are friendlies played around the world. But as we also know, they're not alone. Despite a global pandemic, this current international break features dozens of friendlies. Just as an example, my home country, the United States, is playing Panama in Austria on Monday. To learn more about the business of friendlies and the international break, I spoke with freelance journalist and contributor to World Soccer magazine, Steve Menery.
Well, I think if a friendly is played in a neutral location, which is what we're talking about, the Brazilian games, then you need that should be, as far as the FIFA rules go, done by a licensed match agent. And those match agents, that you can call them agent/stroke promoters. They're often much the same thing, really. And they'll do those games either on a cut or for a flat fee. And often the same guys will be organising club matches as international games. So any game played by two teams from two different countries and the match is in a third country, that needs to involve a match agent, whether it's club or national team. And some of the promoters prefer to work with the national teams because they're more likely to take a kind of strategic view on the game and a more coaching view. Whereas if you're taking a club, if a club's going to go to, let's say Juventus go to China and they play a game and they market it with Ronaldo playing and he's sat on the bench and doesn't even get on the field, then people are going to get quite agitated about that and might start asking for their money back. With the national team, you kind of got the cachet of that it is Brazil. There's a lot of different players. And so they're more likely to take on those games. I think some of the promoters I know certainly wouldn't work with club teams for that reason, prefer national teams.
And just to be clear, when a country has a game in their own country, let's say, Portugal has a friendly against Germany in Portugal, do match agents put those on as well in those friendly games?
I think they can do, but there's nothing really stopping. That the organiser of that game in the first instance would really be the Portuguese Federation because they've invited the Germans to come to Portugal. It's more the what you might call the promotional friendlies where the match agents get involved. And there's only certain teams that can make those games work. You mentioned Argentina playing Uruguay and Israel. Well, those are two big, well-known teams with a lot of big players in them. Some of those other games aren't necessarily going to work. And and FIFA's tried to kind of stop those games happening at the lower level because of fixing problems, and that's why they brought the Nations League in, or that was one of the reasons for it.
Before we get to maybe some of the downsides, these promotional games, as you've been calling them, how much revenue do they generate? How much money is kind of on the table for these types of games?
It's quite hard to, on a national level, I couldn't say with any great certainty. I know certainly at a club level, you're going back 4 or 5, 6 years, the clubs were charging €1 million a game to come and play a game. I mean, I know Real Madrid came to Bournemouth and played a game and charged €1 million. And that's a kind of base level for those sort of transnational clubs. The national teams, again, I suppose it's whatever the agents can leverage out the game or whatever someone's willing to put that game on. If it means something in terms of political or commercial purposes for you to bring that team over, then Qatar are playing a lot of games, right? They went to Brazil last year and played a friendly on the eve of the Copa America there. And so that had those kind of political reasons for playing that game. But it depends on someone's got to foot the bill at the end of the day, and it just depends on what it's worth. It's a bit like selling a house in a way. It's what it's worth to the buyer, really.
Yeah, I know The Guardian reported when Brazil came to Qatar in 2015 that they actually made that game happen for £8.5 million. But interestingly, only 2 million went to Argentina and 1.5 went to Brazil. So, I mean, there is some money in it.
Yeah, it would seem to be. I mean, I saw those figures, the Quintara ones as well, and that's that was very illustrative, really, because those figures very rarely get bandied around for national teams. You're looking at those two teams. That's got to be your premier promotional friendly, really. You're not going to get many more teams that are likely to do that. And also, I think the Brazilians and the South American teams, they're able to do this because there's no Nations League in South America, and they can play whatever friendlies they want, and the impact on their national rankings. In the FIFA rankings doesn't matter quite so much because, it doesn't matter what pot they're going to be in for a seeding because there aren't any seedings, whereas the European teams, the Asian teams, the African teams, the CONCACAF teams, their ranking matters a little bit more.
And just kind of so we can put this in some perspective, how much do players get when Brazil go to, for example, one of these nations plays a promotional game? How much would a player typically get?
At the top end, I don't know. I suppose you can only divide down that, that figure that they got 1.5 million for, I think, Brazil, as you said, and 2 million for Argentina, and divide that down. Well, the federation are going to take some. The coaches will get a cut. Would that be 6 figures? I don't know. I would have thought probably less. I mean, it's hard to tell with any certainty. The federation are going to play in those games because the federation want to make some money. I don't think they're doing it because they want to make some money for the players.
Interestingly, there was actually a report by the BBC back in 2018 that showed that players from England from the years 2008 and 2018 shared about £41,000 per game. So just to do some rough math, you're looking at about £2,000 per game for each English player. Could you explain how much players get just for coming to a training camp?
Well, so if they're inviting the players on a training camp, or if a player's getting called up, I think certainly with some of the emerging countries, they don't discuss the fee that the player will get paid. So they might say, you've been called up by X country, and the player will go, oh, brilliant chance to play international football. So they'll go, maybe it's country of their parents or whatever. So they'll go, and the money they're getting paid won't necessarily, be mentioned. It'll come some way down the line, and some football federations need some chasing with fees. I mean, I'll give you an example. Ghana played a game in Indonesia 3 years ago, and a friendly match that was. So that was a kind of promotional type game that we were talking about earlier. And they've just got paid. Now, the money they were getting paid was about $70 a day plus goal bonuses. And they lost the game, so they didn't get a win bonus. So it's taken them 3 years to get the money. So this kind of money that the players are getting offered, $100 a day for a training camp might be the kind of base rate. Some could be less. Some can be more. Then they'll get win bonuses with that. The lower and mid-ranking countries, they're not getting much money for playing these training camps. $100 a day depends where you come from, really, doesn't it? It depends what club you're playing for, but it probably doesn't match up to a reasonable club salary.
Just reading between the lines or inferring a little bit, I mean, what you're saying is kind of that in many ways, the people who maybe lose out the most with these friendlies often can be the players. They don't get paid much, and they have to go through all this effort.
Yeah, absolutely right. That's right. And if it's a promotional game, the promoter will be arranging it directly with the FA. The FA will be arranging their cut, and it will then be up to the FA to what they're going to pay the players. And that's up to the players to kind of negotiate that fee. It depends on how strong a position they're in. And if it's a kind of a small team going to someone like Asia to play a game, they're in a less strong a position. And then, it's taken them a long time to get that money to chase it up. And it's even out of big tournaments, really. You look at Trinidad qualified for the World Cup in 2006. They negotiated a reasonable money. They tried to knock them back down again. It took them a long time to get that money out of the federation. So, I think the players, they can be taken advantage of sometimes with these games, and particularly in a friendly, because if you get called up, as an experiment, a coach thinks, let's give such and such guy a game in a friendly match, and you call them up, you're keen to go because you want a chance to play international football, and then no one mentions the fee, right? You might get your flight out there, you could be giving up the international break and the recovery time that you would get as a non-international player to traipse all the way around the world. Maybe get a game, maybe not get a game, maybe not get very much money either.
The Hungarians appear to have decided it's time, and there is the whistle. It's all over. England 3, Hungary 6. England 3, Hungary 6.
If we zoom out or take a historical context, when you were a child, what was the point of a friendly?
I think friendlies maybe, mattered a little bit more then because they hadn't been oversold. And teams, and sometimes also you might get teams that will come, maybe will come to England that people didn't know about. If you go back to the 50s, I mean, that was before I was born, but you got some of the Eastern European teams would come to England and play those games. They were massively of interest because people didn't know anything about those clubs or those countries outside of a World Cup or the European Championship started in the 60s. So there was something, there was an interest there. There's something, the world wasn't as connected as it is now, and people, thinking, well, this team's, Peru's rocked up and played this game. What do we know about Peru? Really not very much at all outside the World Cup. And so there will be a kind of a cachet and interest there now. Well, we're also connected now that you can find out very quickly about another team and whether it's worth watching that game. And, perhaps it might not be these days.
So what you're kind of saying is that back in the 60s, 70s, and obviously even before that, this was as an exercise to kind of show off your country's players and talent, before obviously all these European Cup competitions became a lot more popular and famous to people that, hadn't really had the opportunity to see these guys.
Absolutely so. Yeah, absolutely.
And so kind of how has it changed now? Like, what's the purpose of a friendly in 2020?
There's a tactical purpose from a coach's point of view. You want to play games, you want to try out different players. The ranking points of friendlies have been reduced now since 2018. So from a coach's point of view, if you play a friendly match, it's not going to have such a detrimental impact on your rankings. Whereas before 2018, you've got some of the European countries looked like they were avoiding friendlies. You got Switzerland, I think it was, were in the top 5 in the world, and they played one friendly in the last year because if they played a friendly, it could actually damage their rankings. Well, now that doesn't happen because the points on offer for a friendly are much less. So therefore, you can experiment more in a friendly, and you can look to perhaps play more friendlies. And there's less hinging on them, I suppose, even more so now. There's also less opportunity in a CONCACAF region in Europe to play friendlies because we've got the Nations League. Whereas you get in Asia, there's no Nations League out there, or in Africa. We've got the AFCON, which gives it slightly less chance for friendlies. But in Asia, you've got a lot of smaller countries that are playing lots of friendlies just to get whatever small ranking points are on offer to move up. So I kind of think they mean different things in different parts of the world.
With the introduction of the Nations League to Europe and North America, and we've talked a little bit about it, how do you anticipate friendlies changing in the future? Are we going to still see friendlies, in 5-10 years?
I think well, they'll always be there because there's a purpose for them. Certainly, if you're going on a training camp, you're going to want to play a match. But I think certainly the Nations League concept is, we've got it in 2 places. Asia have talked about it as well. Asia would have to restructure their calendar. So at the moment you've got a couple of places where we've got the Nations League, and that reduces the friendlies, and a couple of other places where there is no Nations League. So that who do they look for opponents when Europe and CONCACAF are playing Nations League games? So you kind of got almost like a 2-tier system, really. And I think friendlies, they'll always be there because the coaches will always want them, and they'll want to play against other national teams. But and I don't think you're going to get the Nations League in South America. So therefore, the South American countries will be the ones that are more likely to carry on playing these kind of promotional games than anyone else.
Joshua Law is a freelance writer and was previously an editor for Yellow and Green Football, which focuses on Brazilian football. Steve Menery is a freelance journalist and contributor to World Soccer magazine. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about those songs in our episode show notes. This episode was produced by myself and John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And before you go, if you're a fan of the show and would like to support us, why not sign up to our Patreon page, where you'll get access to full interviews, bonus episodes, and extra content. And if you can't spare the cash, please tell a friend instead. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.